We have a solemnity again. We had 2 weeks ago the solemnity of the Trinity. Last week the solemnity of the body and blood of Jesus. And today the solemnity of Peter and Paul. This past Friday we had the solemnity of the Sacred Heart, and yesterday the solemnity of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. So this is the end. We will begin ordinary time next week, the first Sunday of July. My, how time flies. Today, north of Boston, Massachusetts, in the town of Gloucester, where there is a huge bay, port, there was a lot of sailing in the early days, whaling, going off to India and Africa. They have the feast solemnity of the blessing of the fleet. And the Archbishop comes from Boston, and all the fishing boats gather in the bay, and I observed there were also launches, but it's just huge. But it's the blessing of the fleet because of Peter being the fisherman. So that's a tradition. And it's really beautiful. Many people come just to watch it, this array of boats in the bay, a harbor in the port. But off, as you're looking out, off to the left, there's another event. And there's a log or a post or something that sticks out over the water. And they grease it. Very slippery. And then people see how far out they can walk before they fall in the water. It's also a great event to watch, people sliding and flopping and crashing into the water. I don't know the relationship between that and the fleet, but they do it. Which reminds me of the saying, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And of course the people on that slippery log try to stand, take very little steps, and whoops! And then we have Peter and Paul, who didn't fall for anything. They stood for something. They stood for their relationship with Jesus. Different relationship. Paul, of course, knocked off his horse, blinded, healed, and given the mission to preach. And he preached mainly to the Gentiles, going around, and we read this in the Acts of the Apostles especially, and in the epistles, he's writing to the communities which he has formed by his standing for something, Jesus, and Jesus in his life. So he's a preacher. And of course, people don't like what he's saying, and they lock him up, and eventually he'll be martyred. He will fall for something, the relationship, his faith relationship with Jesus. And then there's Peter, whom we know was called out of his boat, called to be a fisher person, standing for Jesus, standing for something. And we know in the gospel today what he's called to. He's called to stand for and at the beginning of the apostolic church. And it's a little story about Jesus. You know, Jesus is not interested in what the popular opinion of him is around. What are people saying about him positively? But it's a setup so then he can say, and Peter, who do you say I am? And Peter makes the declaration, the first declaration, actually, of Jesus as the long-awaited Christos, the anointed, the Messiah. He says that as a faithful Jew, that I believe, Peter says, that you are what we've been waiting for. You are the new person of God, not just in the tablet of the laws and the strictures, but in the relationship. And Jesus says to him, okay, you've spoken correctly. I give you the keys of the kingdom. Just a side thought, this text has been used to defend the church, that the church is the one true apostolic church and everybody else is excluded. And there was a heresy, a teaching outside the boat, outside the church, there's no salvation. It's only in this church. And you stood by the church, and Peter stood by the church until he too was killed. But we have a great story. He's lying there, and an angel comes. This is in the Acts of the Apostles, the first reading today. He is released from the bounds and taken, we don't hear it, but he's taken, he goes to the community, the early church. So it's a great celebration of two people, and then the many after him who stood for the one thing, the Christ, the anointed. And what is that Christ saying about those whom he is calling? He is calling not just the excluded are out here, the included are here. No. The keys are the preservation, I think. It's not the keys who believe in the Pope, who believe in bishops and the teachings. The keys lock in the solidity of Christ as the center of the church and his gospel authentic, the keys of interpretation, the keys of understanding. He's given them, the early apostles, not the keys to exclude, but to stay faithful. And we stand with Christ in the church. But the church is big, not inclusive, not exclusive. So, as we say, it's hard to keep a good man down. It's hard to keep Peter and Paul down. And they're celebrated as the foundational experiences, their belief. What does all that mean to me as church? I think we carry the church in our life and pass it on, as Peter and Paul did. They were given the keys for freedom to proclaim the gospel that they're protecting. So how do we pass on the church like they did? Preaching. Peter wrote epistles. Paul wrote epistles. They both founded communities. Peter usually within the Jewish community and Paul outside. But the church is an inside and outside experience, inviting. So the question is, I will stand for a something, Jesus. And I won't fall for other gods, other ways of living my life. And we are called to, as much as we can, stay faithful to the relationship that Jesus has with us. The Jesus who says, whose sins you've forgiven, they're forgiven. What you bind in your flesh and your spirit, they'll be bound in heaven. You are bound, not tied down, but you are commissioned. You have the burden of living whatever Christ's relationship with you is. He had a different relationship with Peter and Paul. Peter was fleshly. Paul was mystical. But they lived it. They were the beginning of what we call the church. It's a continuation of the community. We have Jewish ancestors. We carry their traditions too. The loving God, the initiating God, the creating God. And the question is on this day, will we stand for Christ? Or will we, as Paul writes, will you be blown around by other thoughts and ways? Will you stand for someone, or you'll fall for anyone? The Christ who comes to us in word and sacrament says, I will stay faithful to you. Church, person, pray to stay faithful to yourself as a believer.